Hi, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from. Um, Today, I want to ask you a question that, when you look at the vast amount of books that we have in this world and the number of languages in which they are written, it's absolutely impossible to read all of them. And especially because sometimes there are wonderful books written in other languages. And they say that some things cannot be translated and some things should not be translated. But today, to answer that question, we have somebody who is going to solve exactly this kind of a problem for us. So, without any further ado, I want to bring in my guest. But before that, let's give my guest a little time to do his makeup. So, all right. So Arunava Sinha has done his makeup and he's all set to join us. Thank you, Arunava. I just want to say thanks for joining us today, and we are going to decode the whole mysterious world of books, translations, languages, and all the nuances. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on your fantastic show, Bijit.
Arnav, I want to ask you this question about, let's get a couple of things right about numbers. I'm told that you've translated about, how many should I say, 50 books, 60 books. What exactly is the number? There's a lot of controversy about that. So, what is that number? How many books have you translated?
Well, just over 60 translated books have been published so far, and there are about another 8 or 9 lying with publishers. They'll come out in the course of the next, 5 to 6 months, maybe 10. So it'll go up to about 70 by the end of the year or early next year.
My gosh, 70 books you've translated.
But some are quite slim, to be honest.
No, no. Then you're sort of taking away from this entire thing that's absolutely phenomenal output, and done over how many years would you say?
About 15 years.
So that's roughly 5 books a year.
Little under, yeah, but I average about that much in terms of publishing, yes.
So how do you sort of do it? Like churn it out like that? I mean, so that's the mystery I have to figure out today. Because how do you manage to write? Because it takes me 3 to 4 years to write one, and you kind of do four in a year. That's embarrassingly prolific.
Well, for a moment, Abhijit, you're a musician, right? You sing. Do you think you would have a problem singing 100 or 200 songs a year, even if you had trouble writing one? You wouldn't, right? The material is right there. All you need to do is render it in the manner that you know best. So translation's a little bit like that. The material that you're going to put in another language is already right there. Someone has gone to the trouble, spent all those 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 years that you mentioned, writing the first version of that book in the language in which it first came out. So for the translator, it is more a matter of taking that material and suiting it to the form and the demands of a new language. And yeah.
No, no,
So
no. Go ahead.
yeah, so it's not something that you can actually do slowly. It is like, it's like, I mean, translators love metaphors for what they do. The one I like the most is walking a tightrope, and it's hard to walk a tightrope very slowly, because then you're definitely going to fall off. You acquire a certain momentum, and you need to keep that momentum and go to the end of the line. So it's very similar with translation, because you're not writing for yourself, you're not writing as you would, you're writing the way somebody else would in this other language. So you're putting on a new writer's or a different writer's clothes, as it were, and also trying to write with their form of creativity and syntax and imagination and so on. So it is not something that you can hold on to for very long. So once you think you've got it, you just need to bash on very quickly and get to the end of the book before suddenly that like the spirit that has settled on your shoulders suddenly decides that, okay, I'm done with you, I'm out of here. So before the spirit can leave, you have to finish it. So and I've exchanged notes with translators around the world, and everybody says the same thing. They all work quickly.
Wow, that's truly amazing. So Arunava, and I have great difficulty calling you Arunav because I have always called you Bultu. So, if I switch back and forth for all the listeners, I've always known him as Bultu. And so this is very awkward for me to say Arunava. It almost seems I'm talking to a stranger. So, but I want to get to this whole thing. You talked about, uh, you know, getting to understand the syntax and the flavor and the language of the original writer. Is it a bit like when actors become characters, so he's not a doctor, but he is pretending to be a doctor, and he sort of must understand this is how a doctor would respond when he's giving good news or bad news. And is that how it is with translation? Is that how you would describe it?
Yes, that's an excellent example, an excellent metaphor. Really, it is very much like acting, because you get on into somebody else's skin, and then you have to be true to that person, the way you perceive them. So whether it is a generic description of the person, such as an actor or a lawyer or a CEO or an entrepreneur like yourself or a trainer, you have to think, you have to try to figure out how they would write. In this case, it's a narrower activity. You don't have to enact their entire lives. You only have to work out how they're writing. Fortunately, their text is already there to guide you, so you don't have to guess. You don't have to do any method learning or anything. The text is right there in front of you on the left hand side of your screen usually, and you read. And as you read, um, after you've read a few pages, it you sort of assimilate and you internalize. And to that extent, it's very much like acting. Suddenly you become that character. And in the same way, when you're translating, suddenly you become that writer in a different language. Now, whether you're doing a good job or a bad job of it, of course, depends on how good you are, one, at acting, and how good you are at judging an actor. Both are important, right? When you decide, when you're trying to act. So the same way for a translator, it's a function of how good are you as a translator, and how good are you at knowing whether you're any good or not, or whether the work that you're producing is any good or not. So like everything else, all of this also comes with experience. And you have translating muscles like you have any other muscles, and the more you use them, the better they function. So that's another reason that translators are prolific, because they really need to keep those muscles going.
Well, I suppose that should apply to any craft, that, the more you do, every time, each of those 10,000 hours of deliberate practice actually makes you better.
That's right.
So,
Yeah. Not all of it needs to go out to the world, mind you. That's
mm.
important, right? But keeping up with the activity is very important.
Tell me more about that.
In the sense that, when I started out, I knew that I would have to, and I started out quite late by standards of most translators. I mean, I was in my 40s when I actually started translating, and it was a roundabout route, because I used to do other things professionally. And I still wouldn't say I'm a professional translator, in the sense that it doesn't add up to all the things that a profession provides. But because of other things that I used to do, I didn't get to translating till much later. As I said, it was, as I keep joking, it was the time for a midlife crisis, and it was a toss up between a red Ferrari or something equally reckless, and something interesting like translation. So that's how it happened. But because I started late, I knew that I had a lot of catching up to do in terms of building my translation skills. So one of the things I would do is what I call riyaz, which is that I'd pick up, over besides what I was working on for publishers, I would just pick up texts of various kind on my own and work on them, work on translating them. This was not meant for publishing. This was not even meant to be shared with anyone. But it is what got the grease flowing, And it also, the other thing about translation is that, like acting, you have to be able to write in 100 different voices. You can't just have your own. So you need to practice in order to be able to slip into all these different voices. So that riyaz stood me in very good stead. I think for the first 5 or 6 years, I did so much riyaz that I was working enough on translations to produce the same number of books that I do now. So, those muscles really got lubricated.
So
Very.
that means you sort of would take a book, try translating it, and sort of go through that whole process. Um,
Yes.
and you mentioned something interesting about speaking in 100 different voices. Give me an example of how that happens. Talk to me about that.
Well, every book, to begin with, every book has its own unique voice, which is
Mm.
a function of a certain constant element, which is the author's voice, which you see some elements repeating themselves from one book to another by the same author. And then each book has its own voice because the author's adopting a different perspective. One might be written in the third person by a ubiquitous narrator, one might be written in the first person by one of the characters in the book. Uh, Something might be written very adventurously in the second person as well. So then one person will use a very classical vocabulary, old fashioned words, long sentences. Another will be very modern. And this is also a function of when they lived and wrote. So, I've translated Bunkim Chandra Chattopadhyay, whose first book came out in 1865, 4 years after Tagore was born. And I'm translating authors whose books have come out 6 months ago. So a gap of what, about 150 years. Naturally, their writing styles are very different. Their relationship with the language, ostensibly the same language, Bangla, but it's very different in terms of the way words are used, constructed, configured. So each book brings its own voice, and it's a voice that you hear in your head as you're reading it very closely, which we all do as readers. I mean, when we're reading, we're actually hearing a silent voice reading that book out to us, which
Mm.
is a sort of combination of our own voice and the writer's voice. And the better the writer is, the more the writer's voice becomes prominent and our own voice recedes, right? So when you're reading a book closely for translation, exactly the same thing happens. You're hearing a voice which speaks in certain cadences, in certain forms of music. There are silences, there are pauses, it speeds up, it slows down. It's someone telling a story for effect in a drawing room. Even if it looks the same because it's all printed words on a white page, the fact is that each story is being told differently and you're hearing it differently. And as a translator, it is that voice that you have to echo as much as possible within the confines of the new language. Now, in my case, because I translate from two culturally very distant languages, Bangla and English, this involves a lot more of jugglery because, if you're translating from, let's say, Bangla to Hindi or from French to English, there's already a lot in common between the cultures that have produced works in those two languages. So they're contiguous. The journey is not as long. But from Bangla to English is a huge journey. There are many things that are said and expressed in Bangla that you cannot say and express in English. It either not possible or it'll sound ludicrous. In fact, I'll give you one example. One of the things, as you know, Abhijit being a fellow Bengali, is that an act of tenderness that we sometimes perform, especially let's say grandparents perform with their grandchildren, is what we call in Bangla "Gaye Hath Buliye Deya," right? You know what that is, which is very tenderly. Now it's going to sound ridiculous the moment I put it in English. It's very tenderly running your fingers over the other person's arm or brow, somewhere on their skin, right? Now imagine how creepy that sounds in English. The moment you put that, it becomes a terrible thing to do, right? It doesn't sound remotely loving or affectionate at all. So, the language into which you're translating has its own cultural framework of what is tender and what is not. Or
So
another example.
how would that translate into English? What would you say?
So, you have to probably say something like tenderly stroked them or stroked their arm, although it is not actually stroking, but you are trying to achieve the same impact. You are trying to convey to the reader that a tender act is being performed. So that is the quality of the original text that you're protecting when you take it over to the new language, right? You're trying to say that the grandmother is being very loving and affectionate with her grandchild. Now,
Mm.
if instead you go literal and you say the grandmother ran her fingertips tenderly over a grandchild's arm, it's not going to sound very inviting. Right? Yeah. So this is the kind of thing that you have to work on while maintaining the voice. I mean, if it is described very brusquely in the Bangla text, it has to sound equally brusque in the English. If it is described lovingly, then it has to sound loving, and so on and so forth.
So,
So
so you are also looking at not just the words, but also the emotion, the context, maybe imagining the scene, which kind of a place it is, and all that. Is that how it is in
absolutely,
your head?
absolutely. In fact, what the academics call affect, which is the way the emotional response that a text evokes in you, that is perhaps the most important thing that you try to produce, because doing meaning of the words is actually the easiest task. Anybody can do it. You can take
Mhm.
any set of words and put down their equivalents or near equivalents in another language.
So, but, is it possible to do that in Google Translate?
It is actually, if you go, it's not very good with sentences, but you can do it word by word if you like. And if you've noticed, looked at some of the machine translations that appear, let's say on Facebook, when you put in a post in another language and you, I mean, I'll just take different language into English as an example. Try putting in a post in Bangla or Hindi, and you will see an English version which may be funny and laughable, but it is not widely inaccurate. And then you realize that it is it is weird not because it is inaccurate, but because it does not capture any of those other dimensions. It is going only for the meaning of the words. As a result, it can't catch metaphors, it can't catch idioms, for example. If you
Yeah.
have an idiom, it'll mean something else altogether if you take it literally. So this kind of thing is why machine translation, I hope at least in my lifetime, is not going to be able to catch up with literary translation, although it can do a good job of interpretation and technical documents. That's fine. I think that works quite well. um, so when you're translating, therefore you are actually taking a whole bunch of things across, and that too not as individually segregated things, but actually as a combined package, right? Because when you're reading a text, you're not reading it as having 10 components. Like music, when you're listening to music or a song, you're not think as the average listener, you're not thinking of it as a combination of notes, rhythm, percussion, guitar chords. You're not. You're just listening to the whole thing, and then you're either getting jumping up to dance, or you're moved. You're thinking of your romances, or you're shedding tears. So that's the effect. And imagine if you take a song and you take a Beatles song. I mean, I'm just going for Beatles because no matter what your age, you'll have heard it. So if you take "I Wanna Hold Your Hand," for example, and you render it in a different language in a way, not because of the words, but because of the pace and the musical backing and so on, that makes you want to weep, then it'll be a terrible translation, right? I mean, of course, in
Sure.
music, you do these things because you deliberately want to create a different effect. That's fine. But as long as you're saying, I want to create the same effect in a different language, you're going to have to pay attention to the pace, rhythm, and all those things that you mentioned, right? The chords, the drum beats, the works. But you can't, again, unlike music, you can't lay on those tracks individually. What
Right.
you create is one complete creation which has all these components which you've heard in your head. When you're reading that text, you've heard and seen, as you said, and imagined all these things. And then you're basically writing down a version in another language, and you're checking it to see, am I still hearing, seeing, feeling, imagining all those things? And it's not a mechanical deconstructed process of translation. It's not like you list down the 10 things that you will, this sentence, I identify these 10 things. So let's see how I can get these 10 things into the new sentence. No, you don't do that. You take the sentence and you write it in the new language. And then maybe you see, am I getting all those 10 things or not? And like everything else, you get used to doing something, then automatically you even the first time you try it, you're going to be fairly close to the end result.
So when you read, a book, let's say you're translating from Bangla to English, do you sort of read it one time in Bangla and hear the English translation in your head? Is that
Well,
how it is?
increasingly you might be interested to know this. Increasingly, I'm trying not even to read the book beforehand, if it is at all
Wow.
possible. In the sense that I'll read a chapter or two just to make sure that I do want to translate this book and I enjoy it enough to do it. But I try not to, because you know why? Then that freshness of the impact that reading a text for the first time, that freshness is lost if you've already read the text a couple of times before. So then your version also becomes a little jaded. But
Mm.
the joy of hearing a new song and singing it immediately, so
Yep.
that brings something, a new quality to it, right? But the point is that music, it's meant, I keep coming back to music or the performing arts. See, we don't, when we go to listen to a concert, for example, or watch a dance performance or even a play, we're not expecting the performer to be doing it for the first time. We know
Sure.
that they've done it many times, so there's a certain practice tease. But when you're reading a book, you don't imagine that the writer has actually written that book 10 times and finally arrived here. You think that there's a certain freshness to it, right? So so just as the writer wrote it in a burst of spontaneity and edited it afterwards, the translator needs to try and work in the same way. But as you mentioned, sometimes when you're reading a book in Bangla, maybe not with the intention of translating, but because Bangla bole na dheki shorge gele dhan bane, so that's another untranslatable saying. But basically, no
But
matter
how
where,
do you translate this? Tell me this.
no matter where Abhijit Bhaduri goes, he will always hold training sessions.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, even if he's given a tour of heaven, he's going to be training the angels there in better HR. So
Gosh. No, no, no. How terrible that.
I know, but you get the idea, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
even when I'm reading somewhere, yeah, I'm at least checking it for translatability, and sometimes I'm playing with some of the words and phrases in my head. So it's annoying. It's very annoying. You can't be a pure reader. And even when I'm reading an English book that has been translated, I'm also thinking, wow, this is really good translation, you know, and that takes some of the joy out of it in a way, but it also adds joy in different dimensions, because then you catch certain things that you see the translators doing, because you're a fellow practitioner, and you feel, why, it's like a footballer watching a football game.
Sure.
They'll watch it very differently from the way you and I will watch it. So it's got its upsides and its downsides, but it is a tremendously involving activity. I mean, you're never not a translator, whether you're actually at any given point of time translating a book or not. You're a translator 24/7.
So it's a little bit like saying that when you get trained in understanding human emotions, you can sort of read the subtext and say, okay, the person is now saying it for effect, and the person is being manipulative. Also, so you can deconstruct it. In some sense, it also takes away the joy of spontaneity of hearing it, and you kind of say that, okay, this person is doing this. Um, and I remember, one time I was talking to a friend of mine who's a filmmaker, and he was saying that when I watch the film, I have to sort of sometimes tell myself, okay, I'll watch the film for the first time, like somebody in the audience. Then I'll go back and watch it many times later if I like it. That, oh, okay, I get it. He took the shot from this angle, cut it, moved the camera, put it back, then he cut it again. It gives the impression that this guy is talking to the other one from a distance. Oh, I like the fact that he's used the light to move and not the camera, because that gives the impression the camera has moved. Actually, it hasn't. And I'm saying, oh my God, and so many things happening in your head. He says, that's why I have to switch it off and watch it the first time. It's just, when did you first start hearing this voice in your head? 15 years
Wait,
back, or was it earlier?
no, it was earlier. I've been hearing the voice ever since I've been in college, really. And I used to do a little bit of amateur translating then. And as a matter of fact, the first novel that came out that I translated and that was published, I actually worked on it many moons ago, soon after college.
Which was Charan.
That was Chorangi by Shankar, so which he had commissioned, and I translated it and I gave it to him. And I actually left Calcutta immediately after that, and I moved to Delhi. And
Because
for
you
14
didn't want him to, if he was upset, you didn't want him to reach you.
yes, that's right. I mean, here it is, and I'm going straight to Howrah station and getting on the train. And no mobile phone those days, so you don't know where I am.
Exactly.
Yeah. So 14 years later, an editor at Penguin Books called me and said, look, we want to publish Torangi in translation. And we got in touch with the author, who said there is already a translation, and he doesn't remember the name of the translator, but he sent us the printout, which was an old dot matrix printout on those accordion sheets in those days. And fortunately, the smartest thing I'd done was put my name on it.
Wow.
So the editor in question knew me because she's also from Calcutta, and Calcutta is really a small village. So she said, "Are you the one?" I said, "Wow, this is a real blast from the past." So it came out 14 years later exactly. But in these 14 intervening 14 years, I did no work on translation. I mean, I was a journalist. First, I worked in the print media. I actually worked with a business magazine, unbelievable as it may seem, because I had zero formal knowledge in anything to do with business. I worked with Business Today for 8 years. But Business Today at that point, soon after I joined, pivoted from being an old-fashioned business magazine to being a management magazine. So that
Mm.
was convenient because it meant that we were all learning. Management was a big thing suddenly in the 90s after liberalization, and there was not enough B schools in India. So a lot of people, especially those who were already employed, were very interested in learning things about management. I remember, Vijit, in I think it was in 1995 or 6, I went to the editor and said, "Look, there's this article somebody sent, and I'm editing it, and I'm going to send it to you. It looks very exciting. It's a 6-page story. It's on something called email." And the editor read it, and he came running out and he said, "This is the cover story for the next magazine." And
Wow.
so in 95, I think we Business Today ran a cover story on something called email. So that's the kind of thing that we used to do. So which was really more about research and writing. The subject was not, you were not bound to a particular subject. So I did that for 8 years, but it was very intensive and there was no time for anything else. And then the internet came along and we started writing about the internet, and I used to actually do that myself. I used to write quite a good deal. There was such a lack of expertise at that point that on the strength of 3 articles I wrote in Business Today on the internet, a management school in Goa asked me to come and teach. Uh,
Wow. Teach
yeah,
management.
teach a course on the internet. And I'm like, are you serious? I'm a complete fraud. And they say, well, with these 3 articles, 300% more than any of us does. So anyway, it's exciting because, those were days when new frontiers were being discovered. So from writing about the internet, I soon actually moved into the internet to work first on internet media. And then soon when I got in there as a journalist, but within a year or so, I realized that the real game on the internet was less about being a journalist and more about managing the product, because so much of it had to do with the user experience. So pretty soon I segued into becoming a product manager for on the internet. And because it was open, it was like the Wild West. Anybody who went in first and set up a homestead could claim that the land was theirs. So it was something like that. You got in first and you did 3 things and you said, "Hey, I'm the boss here. No, I know you don't know this. I know how to do this." So I've always sort of worked in that way, in the sense, always moved into areas which did not need so much of embedded expertise because not enough people had it, and I could do bluff my way through it, and also do the homework to learn as much as I could. So it was very interesting because I never thought that being a business journalist for 8 years in and writing about writing and editing and rewriting pieces on management and marketing and technology, that is to say personal technology, I didn't realize at that point that it was actually priming me to be able to, for the rest of my working life, do new things at the drop of a hat. Because
Yeah.
back then you used to think of careers as being one long trajectory from start to finish, and you didn't move left or right, you didn't go sideways in any direction. So it's amazing, really. When I look back, how things you do at one point, only because it seems exciting then, eventually pre- prepares you for something else altogether. But the base set of skills, for the lack of a better word, I'm a little hesitant to use the word skills because I think it's somewhat overused and misused nowadays, especially in the context of education. But you know what I mean. More than the ability to do something, which I think anyone can learn, it's the willingness to do it when you haven't done it in the past. I think that is what in many ways my odd journey through journalism and internet product management eventually brought me to a point where I translate books, I work as a books editor on scroll.in, and I teach at a university. I teach creative writing, which includes translation courses. So it's very strange how all the streams have converged almost without my having been aware that it was possible or even expecting it to happen. And
So,
now, oddly enough, we are now setting up a translation center at Ashoka University, which requires a lot of work on the internet because it involves setting up databases of translated works and websites. So now I'm back to working on those things. So I'm also the sort of amateur internet expert on some of these things. So it's amazing how everything you work on at some point comes back to you and asks you to do more with it.
I kind of I think that that also happens with pretty much any profession if you sort of look at it, because when you start your career, and I remember writing about this in one of the articles, that everything that I did when I finished from B school, the name of the school has changed. The diploma or degree that was given, that's now called something different. The profession used to be, you were sort of entering something called personnel management, and people were still using the word like labor relations, because that's what the diploma said, that labor
Yeah.
relations, and then
And
it
the
became,
institute, that's what it was called.
and the institute, yeah, and they were the labor relations institute,
Yeah.
uh, and then it became human resources, and people said, no, no, it's basically the same stuff explained differently, and then it became talent management, and in each one of them, different elements have become more prominent, but the mix that you worked with, that remains the same. So for example, now if you see, there's a lot of work which is happening in employee relations, and my belief is that it's going to become far more prominent going forward, as compared to, let's say, when I started, everyone said that you need to start your career in a factory, because that's where you will learn what really matters.
Hmm.
But now, when you sort of look at that, the factory has moved into a different setup altogether. Office and home have got merged. So, in this
Yeah.
new
Yeah.
hybrid reality, you're going to sort of look at that differently. Um, for you, would did the pandemic mean a very radically different shift, or you kind of sat at the same desk and translated, which you did anyway? Uh, how was
Yeah.
it?
To be honest, I count myself as really lucky in that the pandemic didn't come in the way of any of the work that I did, which was incredibly fortunate. So the translation, yes, as you said, I translate. Frankly, I translate wherever I can hold a laptop or an iPad, and occasionally even on my phone. So I can translate anywhere. So and in any case, I was mostly homebound, so it was not a problem for me. I think one minor problem was having people around at home. I was not used to that. But it wasn't a bad thing, to be honest. So that was simple. My editing work for Scroll, in any case, was work from home. I mean, I used to go into the office now and then, but it was not necessary. I worked from home. I went into the office just to have coffee and meet people. And teaching at Ashoka University, we were among the first to pivot to online classes fairly smoothly. I think, frankly, it was the benefit of being having some privileges in terms of having good infrastructure and teachers and students who have access to computers and the internet and so on. So all this allowed us to pivot very quickly. I mean, by we broke for the midterm break in the middle of March 2020, and we never went back. So within a week, we had moved to online classes. Just within a week. I mean, we left the campus thinking, okay, see you in a week, and in that 1 week, everything changed. And by the following Monday, we were holding classes on Zoom. So that has actually, in some ways, given me a few hours of my life back, because it's a long commute from home to the campus. So to that extent, I've actually got a little bit of more time to translate or read or sleep. um, so no, it hasn't changed all that much for me, other than the fact that teaching online is not really as satisfying, or learning online for that matter is not really as satisfying. And of course, it is not inclusive either, because even at a private university, you still end up with the students who, not all of whom, have the same quality of access. So at Ashoka, for example, those who have not had computers or access to the internet were actually brought back on campus so that they could use the campus infrastructure. But how it is. Meeting your students in little rectangular boxes where they seem trapped is not the same thing as meeting them in a common space.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I mean, I just think that for me, the greatest thrill lies in being able to interact with people and responding to them. Otherwise, everything is extremely flat, two dimensional, and sort of surreal. It is efficient. But I just think that we make too much of a deal about efficiency and not enough about the experience of teaching.
Yeah.
It is so, so dissatisfying.
No,
And
absolutely. Yeah.
personally, I always think that. Uh, the workplaces, and you sort of in some sense use exactly that phrase, which is quite interesting. then you should do your work at home perhaps and then go to office to socialize, have a
Hmm.
cup of coffee, ideate with your friends, and maybe brainstorm about something different that you want to do, all of that. Because otherwise you kind of really today when you read about what so many psychologists are talking about, that the mental health challenges are actually ironically for all the introverts, because when the lockdown happened, people said that it's good for the introverts because they don't now need to meet people. Actually, the introverts are experiencing a lot more burnouts, a lot more of this. The extroverts are unhappy for a different reason, that they want to go out and they want to meet people and they want to do that. But even the ones who want to stay at home are experiencing the byproduct of this. um, when I look at translation, one of the questions I always wondered when I look at your work, you've done a lot of fiction. You've obviously done poetry. I have got some of the books that you've done on Sunil Gangpadhyay, who's, of course, and my sole regret in life is that I never got to meet him. He was my absolute hero, when it came to writing. What was he like to work with?
No, I didn't really work with him. You know, he was like many others who write in Bangla. They were not particularly interested in English translation, so it didn't matter too much to them.
When you look at many of the films, when you see a book which gets made into a film, whether it's Harry Potter, I remember sort of seeing that. In most instances, people say that it was disappointing because, again, the voice in your head and the pictures in your head, especially if it's really well written, you can almost sort of say that this is what the person looks like, this is the
Hmm.
kind of clothes the person wears. So you actually construct the film in your head. And when you construct it in your head, no matter how good the director is, in most cases, you do land up feeling very disappointed. The film Ray, which has come on Netflix now,
Yeah.
has been sort of clobbered for exactly the same reason. But I think it's an unfair kind of thing. What do you feel about it?
Yeah. For example, these are to begin with. These are two different media, so it's unfair really to judge the quality of a film on the basis of its relationship with the text on which it is based. I don't think that that's a fair way of looking at it. It is using the text as a starting point, but each medium demands its own way of storytelling. So, for example, in film, you're not going to be able to present internal thoughts. You can't
Mm.
present anything that's going on inside a person's head, right? So, automatically, what are you going to do? You're going to actually cut down on those elements and you're going to put in more of conversations and actions. You don't have a choice there. Um, that automatically people who relate very closely to meditative passages in texts are going to be very upset about that. I don't take that very seriously. In fact, there are two responses I'll give you. When Chupalaidi was asked about the film version of The Namesake, she said it's Mira Nair's namesake, which is I think right. I mean, the film is Mira Nair's and the novel is Jhumpa and you can
Was that statement expressing disappointment that,
no,
I
no,
don't relate to
no.
it at all?
No, she was saying that the moment I said yes, make a film out of my book, I knew that it was going to be somebody else's film. I mean, an intelligent writer would be stupid if they thought that a book written in words can be reproduced in the same way in a completely different medium. It can't. In fact, if anything, only bad books can that can happen to only bad books, because
Mm.
only bad books have those elements which don't need
All
any change.
spelled.
Sorry, also.
A lot of times popular fiction spells out everything. He felt
Yeah,
bad.
yeah,
Then
exactly.
they walked
Yeah,
across. So,
and when the characters have no internal life, or when there is nothing happening outside of the action, then it's easy to take a book and reproduce it hubahu as a film, right? It's practically a screenplay already. But that's a very ordinary book. The qualities of a book that you really remember, great literature, are not those, not the action. It's actually everything else, the subtext, and of course the text, the music of the text itself. How are you going to put that in film? You have to create a different kind of music in film. And then the writer Shankar, who two of whose novels were made into film by Satyajit Ray. So it's interesting that Ray's texts are being shown up as examples of stories that have not been done justice to by filmmakers. And yet Ray himself, barring two or three, all his films were based on literature, based on text, and he faced resounding criticism in many cases for so-called deviations from the text. So it's something unique to the way of working. It's not specific to one film or the other. So when Shankar was asked about Ray adapting his work, he said, of course, Shankar being Shankar always spoke tongue in cheek. He said, "Look, if you have a daughter and your daughter gets married, are you going to criticize your son-in-law?"
Oh gosh, yeah, that's brilliant, brilliant sort of way
Yeah,
of putting it.
yeah,
Without
yeah.
being offensive.
Yeah.
Uh,
So I guess, I mean, you own your baby and you think that nobody else can make your baby again, and that is correct. And they shouldn't either, right? If your baby is so unique, then how can that baby be cloned? Shouldn't be cloned, if anything.
so,
So
so that difference is actually a sign of good filmmaking, or is it a sign of good writing? Which one is it?
I think it's a sign of good writing to begin with, because there is clearly material in there in the written form that cannot be put into the film. So the filmmaker then has to improvise and do other things, and that I think is means that the text has qualities of literature, the written word, that are unique to that medium, which
Uh,
cannot be used in another medium.
what if you watch a film and then write a story which is exactly that? I mean, you ever tried doing that?
People have done it. They call it the novelization of the film. My question is, what's the point? If the work works well as a film, why not watch the film? I mean, what is the point of artificially pulling it out and putting it in? You never thought of writing this book. You're only writing this book because the film is popular and you think that you can cash in on that franchise. I don't think that makes sense. I don't think these books have worked particularly either. They may have had made a temporary splash, but largely no. So I'm not hung up on the congruence between the story of the film or the treatment in the film and the text on which it is based. But I would, as in the case of translation, like to see the values of the text reproduced in the film. So if the text is a highly effective text that makes me pause and think and wonder, it would be lovely to have something like that from the film as well. And yet at the same time, if the film can take the same story and make me laugh and giggle and feel uh, joyous, then maybe, hey, what's wrong with that either? As we said, if you take like if you've heard Deep Purple's version of Help, they turn it into this into this plaintive plea, but the
Sure,
Beatles Help is not plaintive at all. It is very energetic.
sure.
So I think it's all right. Ultimately, you judge the work on its own strength, right?
And when you see the same book done once in say English and then once as a Bengali film, let's imagine you've translated the book from Bangla to English, and
Right.
then then there is a movie made in Bangla and English. So these are then four different pieces of work.
They're four different pieces of work with varying degrees of closeness to the original, but certainly each one is a unique piece of work, and it has to be faithful to the medium in which it is being made. It has to be faithful to the time in which it is being made. Even if you make a period film in 2021, you're not going to make it the same way that it would have. Let's say you're making a film today that's set 100 years ago in 1921. If the same film were made in 1921, it would look very different from the way you're going to make it now. And I don't mean just in technical terms. Just that your worldview is different, your sensibility is different. You know much more of what has happened in the intervening 100 years, and like it or not, that is going to impact your view. And you, as a viewer, I would want that to happen. I want to be able to understand what you make of the world. And therefore, with your understanding of the world, how do you look at something that happened 100 years ago? That is what I would like to see and absorb and reflect on. So each time you make it, it's a different work. In fact, some books are translated over and over again, at intervals of 20, 30 years. New translations are made of old texts. And
Give
I
me an
think it's very.
example of that.
Oh, there's no end of it. I mean, the one great example, for instance, is Albert Camus' The Outsider, which has been translated, which has at least four different English translations made at different points of time. And you can actually put them next to each other and figure out roughly. I mean, you can't get it down to the precise year, but you can certainly put them in chronological order as a reader and say, okay, this is the oldest and this is the newest, and these two came in between, because you can see little changes that are taking place. So it's interesting. Any book is written for a contemporary readership, whether it is was written in 1956 or 2016, it doesn't matter, right? So, like for example, the first novel in the Bangla language, and many say the first novel in India, was written by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. It was called Durgesh Nandini,
Mm-hmm.
the Castellan's daughter. It was a racy historical romance. We think of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay as this august figure of, one of the founding fathers of Indian literature. He was 26. Okay, he was 26 at the time. He had written an English novel which had bombed spectacularly. The freedom movement was on. He didn't know who he was at that point. He didn't have his thinking perfectly formed. Who does at 26? No one does, right? Unless you are one of those annoying startup founders. Yeah. So he wrote this racy novel, okay, where there are interreligious romances and there's swashbuckling battles, and every if you read it today, you'll say, "Wow, this is what you call a masala film," right? So he wrote it for a contemporary audience. Now the question is, I translated it in 2010, I think. In 2010, do I make it sound like a period piece which is so dull because it was written 150 years ago? Or do I say, no, what I will try to be true to is the contemporary intent of this book? And let's see if we can also make it racy for today's reader and not a relic, not a historical period piece. Of course, it's set in that period. As it turns out, that novel was also not set in 1861. It was set in the 15th century. So that was convenient. He was already writing a historical novel. So you start thinking of these characters as being racy by today's standards, because if they were racy then, they will appear pretty dated now. So it's not that you make up anything, you add anything to the text, but in your head you just imagine them as contemporary racy characters, and then you take that same text and you start writing, and you suddenly find that, hey, you're writing it in this zip zap zoom kind of fashion, which is very far removed from what people associate Bankim Chandra with, because they're reading him 100 years later. But when they read him at that time, they were reading him like Chetan Bhagat.
Mm, mm, mm.
So their expectation was not anything else.
When you translate, so many different writers, you've done a range of people. How do you pick a writer or do you pick a book? Which of these
Well,
is it?
I pick a book, but very often what happens is that one book leads you to want to find out more of what that writer has written. So sometimes I have ended up translating 3 or 4 books by the same writer.
Oh, who is that?
Well, Tagore,
Most number of books
I think
by
that
the
would
same writer.
that would probably be Buddhadev Boshu. I've done 5 of his books. Then Shongita Bandyopadhyay, I've done 3 of hers. Tagore, I've done about 4 or 5, and there are several writers of whose I've done 2 or even 3 in some cases. So that happens. You do, and you develop. Every translator also develops an affinity with certain writers. Maybe there's something common in their worldview, something common in their artistic sensibilities. So sometimes I've read some very good books which I have not attempted to translate because I know that there's something. It's not for me. It will find another translator who will do a great job, but I will not be able to do a great job with this book because there's a barrier somewhere. I can't quite develop that relationship with it, although I can see it's a wonderful book. So that happens as well. It's like music, right? I mean, sometimes there's that there's some great music, but you will not sing it.
Mm. When you think about, you're very, very prolific on all the social media platforms. I kind of the fact that you've got Arunava as a handle on Twitter. That's a giveaway that you obviously have to have been one of the earliest adopters of the medium. Um, when you do you kind of find that you want to ever start writing in Bangla in those mediums as well as a way of just sharpening the craft? Have you ever thought of doing that?
Well, I'm already translating into Bangla. One book's come out, two more are coming out this year, and I do post some translations in Bangla on social
I see
media.
that
Yeah,
on Facebook a lot,
yeah,
so
yeah,
those,
yeah.
so the listeners who are, just watching this, I really recommend you follow Arunava on Facebook as well as Twitter. He puts out some really incredibly powerful pieces of writing. They are great pieces of writing, regardless of whether you've read that piece or not. But
Thank you for the
yeah,
shout out.
I sort of have really enjoyed reading that. Question for you is that do you ever think that you want to do English to Bengali or
That's what
Hindi
I'm
to
doing.
Bengali? No, no, no. I
English.
mean, and then would you Hindi to Bengali? Do you want to do something like that?
Yes, I'm in fact, and you're the first to know, I'm actually toying or trying to formulate the notion of taking a Hindi text and translating it both into English and Bangla.
Simultaneously?
Well, I mean, not literally simultaneously, but yeah.
It's a little bit like the juggler when you practice. They say
Yeah,
when you sort of move to three, you are really beginning to learn to juggle. And then when you
yeah,
can move to five, you are a professional.
yeah,
So it's a little bit of that. So we are going to see
yeah.
one day five languages. Yeah.
Well,
Do
I
you
don't know
ever
about
think?
five, but I think I can read Hindi well enough to be able to translate from it certain kinds of text, the modern text. I won't be able to do it with older texts
So would
because
you
I
be
don't
able
have
to
a
do
historical
Premchand?
understanding of the language. Sorry?
Would you do Premchand kind of
I would
translation?
not. I would not do Premchand because I don't. I have my reading in Hindi is not so deep as to be able to place Premchand in a certain context of the use of the language. But with modern writers, it's easier because their language is closer to the kind of language we. I don't use Hindi in everyday life except transactionally. I don't use it for leisure or for professional purposes. But because I live in Delhi, a whole bunch of conversations take place in Hindi anyway. And there's a lot of writing now, naturally, that uses this kind of parlance. And I will need help. It's going to be slow and I'll need some validation. But I do want to do this because also another thing is that as you get older, you also want to try more difficult things. Whether you succeed or not is less important, but you want to try because you otherwise your muscles atrophy. And sometimes when you're doing something over and over again, it becomes a little easy, and it's wonderful to be able to do it with ease, but it's also equally exciting to take on a truly challenging task which you are not very, it takes you into uncomfortable uncharted territory. I don't know, maybe that's something that I've always had, but I have not given up that idea.
And what would be something which today seems unachievable, but you still want to give it a shot anyway, as far as your work is concerned? What would that be?
Well, I'd like to learn uh, maybe one of the South Indian languages and translate from it into English and Bangla. I haven't even taken the shortest of steps towards it, and I don't know when I will or if I will, but it's still very much there as a dream,
And
hope, pipe dream, whatever you want to call it.
you've done a lot of translation of writers from Bangladesh. So
Of
you sort of,
Yeah.
yeah. So I've read only a couple of them. So I have the impression that you've done quite a few. So do you by and large choose contemporary writers, or you've done people who've.
You mean from Bangladesh?
Mhm.
Well, Bangladesh is only a 50-year-old country.
That's
So, in a
true.
sense, their
True.
literature's, if it's Bangladesh, then it's not very old technically. But of course, there were older writers and they've been writing for a much longer time. Well, no, I've not specifically limited myself to certain time periods, but it so happens that the greatest novel that I've translated so far out of this large number is actually this book, the new book that's just come out called Khwab Nama. It's written by a writer from Bangladesh named Akhtaruzzaman Ilyas, and it's undoubtedly the greatest novel I've translated. And it is, honestly, if publishers used to ask me when I pitched translations to them, but where is South Asia's 100 Years of Solitude? And this is actually South Asia's 100 Years of Solitude, not in terms of not in terms of similarities, but in terms of excellence and vastness and magic. I don't mean magical reality, but just magic that a text can do. So he wrote it in the 90s. He It was published, I think, in 97. He was actually fighting cancer as he was finishing it, and he died soon after. So I don't know if you'd call that modern. People of our age tend to think of the 1980s and 90s as modern till you realize that it's not anymore. Those are very far in the past. And my students remind me all the time, because every time I talk to them about, a recent novel published in 1997, and they're like, we weren't even born. Our parents weren't even married. So, not even born is out of the question. They're all born in this century. But you know what I mean. So yeah, the whole definition of modern also changes as you go along, or contemporary, let's say, changes as you go along. I mean, we're 20 years into this century already.
And so, when you sort of started to translate Khwabnama, what was the trigger?
The
You had
trigger
read
was,
it, you were mesmerized
no,
by
I
that?
hadn't read the whole thing. The trigger was its reputation, and its reputation, and um, hundreds of people telling me that it was untranslatable. So I started it as a challenge to myself. And then little further down the line, I realized that I would be able to pull it off. Though at one point I had serious doubts again. And I used to tell everyone that either this book will make it or I will make it. I don't think both of us will survive to see the world. But, well. So about a third in, I realized that, okay, this can work as a book. I mean, but I'm still very, very nervous about it, because it's got such an enormous reputation that I'm quite sure that some people will tear it to shreds. Having read the Bangla version, they will feel that the English translation is completely inadequate. And I'm perfectly prepared for that. And my thinking also is that the first translation is very necessary for a great book. And if this translation is inadequate, someone else will come along and do a better one. But they couldn't have done that better one without this one to begin with.
So, when
So
there
you
is a better translation, will you feel bad that it's better than what you've done?
Yeah, I'll feel bad because I'll feel like, why could I not have done this? But I'll also feel good because if I recognize it as a better translation, I'll feel, yes, I'm very glad that it's come.
I always, when a book gets published, I'm always the most fond of my most recent kid, in some sense. And then you kind of think of the older ones. Um, is that how it is for you, or is the first book very special for you? Is the last book very special for you? Um,
So see, there is this peculiar thing with translators, which is that by the time you submit a translation, and then by the time it comes out, you finish two or three others. So your relationship with that, with the latest book, is actually kind of quite tenuous by then, because you're already, your closest relationship at any given point is with the book you're working on. And it's
hmm,
the same, not the same with authors, right? Mostly they will finish a book and they will not necessarily be working on the next one before the last one comes out.
Absolutely. No chance. You feel so drained. Every time I'm in the last stages of a book, I think this is the last one. I'll never write another one again. It's
Yeah,
so
yeah. With
depth.
me, it's like if I finish a translation at 7 o'clock, I'll start a new one at 7:15.
My
So
God, really? Is that
yeah,
how it is?
it's substance abuse. Basically, that's what it is. Yeah.
Oh, gosh. So,
So
so
yeah, and also you read your own work and you hate it because the flaws just jump out at you afterwards.
absolutely. As soon as it's printed, you immediately look at it and say, "Oh my God, I
Yeah,
think I should have done one more draft."
yeah,
So,
exactly,
how
exactly.
many
So
drafts do you
I
do?
don't even read it. I don't even read it because I know I'm going to be terribly unhappy.
How many drafts do you do of a translation, or do you kind
Usually,
of
no,
edit
I
it
do
along
two
the way?
drafts. I do one big original draft, and then I edit it fairly quickly.
How
And
many
then
hours a
I
day
don't
do
do.
you write?
I'm sorry.
How many hours a day do you write?
Um, I try to write about 6 hours a day, 5 to 6 hours a day. So about 4 hours in the morning and two at night.
So,
And then the rest of the day is teaching and scroll. Rest of the work day, that is, which is pretty much the entire day. I mean, I don't have a life. all I do is work.
Um, Arunava, this has been just one of the most fascinating conversations I've had because there's so much that you've told me, which is so amazingly unique. The world of translation. I've never really attempted to translate anything, and I'm just completely in awe of the fact that you've translated 70 books, which is bizarrely prolific. And more power to you. I hope you translate many more. Wish you much more success. And when you're going for that big prize, remember that this is the prediction that you are going to be winning that huge prize money, and you got to share it with me. Until then, thank you so very much. I just want to sort of say thanks to everyone who's watching it, who's joined in, and who's stayed with us all the questions. I got so carried away, I didn't really quite take a look at the questions that you have put. But thank you so very much once again, Arnav. All the best. Just stay on. I'll catch you as soon as this ends.
Thank
Goodbye.
you very much. It was lovely talking to you.